I welcome to Bandkind New York Times best-selling author Michael Punke. Okay.
Hi, this is Michael Punke, and this is One Small Step for Bandkind.
May I recommend a book from the author we have coming up next? Such a treat. His name is Michael Punke, and he has a diverse career spanning writing, public service, and business, but best known as the writer of The Revenant, basis for the Academy Award-winning film. The Revenant was a #1 New York Times bestseller and was published in more than 20 languages. Punke also wrote Fire and Brimstone, the North Butte mining disaster of 1917, which I just love, Last Stand with George Bird Grinnell, The Battle to Save the Buffalo, and The Birth of the New West. And his latest, called Ridgeline, which won the 2022 Spur Award for Best Historic Novel. And you're about to see why. Michael Punke is a commentator on Western history, appearing most recently on Ken Burns' documentary, The American Buffalo, and in Kevin Costner's The West on the History Channel.
Delta Peace, plus 0.4, and we're going to secure the high gain and give you Omni Bravo.
Hi, I'm Nick, and I'm so excited to introduce you or reintroduce you or to take you even deeper into the literature, the legacy of Michael Punke. Welcome, Michael. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to talk today.
Oh my goodness. We're going to dive deep into a lot of your work. And I want to frame it for people. I really see survivalists, humanity, development and loss, and the cost of that happening in a lot of your offerings. Is that something you shoot for off the top? Is that something just in you?
Well, I'm not sure if I exactly consciously shoot for that off the top or not, but I do look for very powerful human stories in history. And I think quite naturally, some of those themes that you just mentioned are some of the human stories that bubble up and make us most excited. I'm not sure that I consciously start off looking at those themes, but I do look for historical stories that have powerful human elements. And some of those themes that you talked about are obviously among the most powerful human experiences that all of us have in our lives. And so I think it's pretty natural that a lot of stories end up gravitating towards places like that.
I actually would like to know your process. Do you write one story and then the other side? For example, Ridgeline, I'm reading, which is your latest. And so you have a way of bringing us into the full capacity of what's happening with the Native Americans. And then you have the full capacity to bring us in with what's happening with the whites. You're allowing us to balance our truth between the two, which is so much of a value for the reader. Do you do that on purpose? And do you write each story separately and then pick where to switch us back and forth?
Well, I mean, as a starting point, I think one of the things that about Western history is that it is enormously complicated. And there are all sorts of different perspectives on history. And I think I feel a real responsibility as somebody telling a historical story to try and bring all of those elements to bear. And all of those stories are interesting in their own way. And many of them are in direct conflict. And two things that are uncomfortable to us can be true at the same time. And that's one of the things that I think my stories try and grapple with. My process is I do a huge amount of historical research before I start writing and before I even decide on what the story is that I want to write is going to be. And I really try and have to find great historical stories because then so much of the interesting work is already done for you. But also because I think when something is true, it's just that more compelling to readers. And then having done that historical research, I do a huge amount of outlining. I think how I want to bring in the perspectives of different lead characters. I outline that. I tend to try and write in a relatively linear fashion from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. But sometimes I will break away from that. And in the example of the book that you're mentioning, Ridgeline, which is about the Fetterman massacre that took place in Wyoming in the Powder River Valley in 1866. I came back from a visit to the battlefield, really with the events of the battle fixed in my head, having just walked the battlefield for 2 days. And in that book, the book culminates with the battlefield scene. And I actually wrote big chunks of the battlefield scene, which is long in the book. It goes on for about 60 pages. I wrote big chunks of that at the beginning, having just come back from the battlefield, and then wrote earlier parts of the story later on, just because I wanted to write that battle when it was very fresh.
That's unbelievable. You're even taking me back to Custer's battlefield. When I was just a child, I remember going there and just letting the wind tell its own story as it was blowing. It seems like it incessantly blows there in that place. And
Yeah.
as you stand in the quietness, encountering the
Yeah.
battlefield, you're right. It is something
Well,
phenomenal.
that's another one of both of those battlefields are among my favorite places on the planet. And you mentioned the Battle of Little Bighorn battlefield in Montana. I love that spot and have stood up on that ridge line, that last stand ridge, many times and surveyed the whole battlefield and valley below. People who like that, I would very much encourage to also visit the Fetterman battlefield site in the Powder River Valley. About 100 miles south of the Custer battlefield is the Fetterman Massacre battlefield. One of the things I really like about the Fetterman battlefield is it's even more removed from the highway. And so you get there's less development up there, and even more of a sense on any given day you can walk that battlefield, and it's very easy to imagine what it looked like, in 1866. Both of those places should be high on anybody's visitation list for sure.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. As a girl that grew up in Montana, and we had talked about this before, but
Right.
I believe your family's from Montana and Wyoming. Is that right?
That's right. I was born and raised in Wyoming, born in a small town called Lovell and raised in another small town called Torrington. My wife was actually born in Wyoming, but she was raised for her whole life in Livingston, Montana. We met actually out on the East Coast, got married out there. Actually got married in Wyoming, but met out there. And then when our kids were 6 and 3, we decided we wanted to raise them in the type of place that we'd been raised, and we ended up moving to Missoula, Montana, which is where I have lived for the most part ever since then.
The Bitterroot Valley.
Yeah, with the end of the Bitterroots for sure.
I was born in Marcus Daly Hospital in the
Yep.
Bitterroot Valley.
Speaking of people from Butte, Marcus Daly.
Yes, Marcus Daly has a huge story in our own family with his ranch right there in Hamilton.
Right.
And he is a big character, so to speak, in your book, Fire and Brimstone.
Right.
It's just remarkable to encounter this story. I want to talk a little bit about some of the characters
Sure.
in here. Would you like to start with Marcus?
Sure.
Marcus Daly makes his way to Montana with what money?
Zero money. He is the classic story of the penniless immigrant. He literally comes to the United States on a boat to New York City as a boy by himself. He takes jobs tending horses, working on the docks in New York City, and eventually he decides he wants to go west. And to go west, he takes a boat to Panama. This is before there was a Panama Canal. He walks across the malarial isthmus of Panama, and then he walks from Panama to California, and he starts working in the mining industry. And he's a little bit late. This is after you think of the 49ers, the gold rush. He's there more in the 1850s. And so he becomes involved in more industrial style mining, ends up in a silver mine, and learns the trade of industrial mining, digging deep tunnels and drifts, using very heavy equipment to mine, and then even heavier equipment to process the ore. He learns all these skills of industrial mining, and it's those skills that lead him to Butte, Montana in the I guess it would have been by then the 1870s.
And I just drove through Butte. It's amazing how it's so expansive. And I love that you can even see these
The headframes.
standing in
Yeah.
Butte today. It's unreal to encounter your words and bringing this story back to life again. It is a fantastic story of really a town that built a state. Would you say that?
For sure.
Hmm.
There's no question that the reason that Montana exists as a state is because of Butte. The Butte Archives, the Butte Silver Bowl Archives, which is this wonderful establishment in Butte that has collected all of this incredible history over the years, and a place where I did a lot of the research for the book, has an inscription on its wall, and it's quoting a mother in Ireland who was sending her early teenage daughter to America by herself to escape the circumstances that they were in. And she gives her this famous directive, and she says, "Don't stop in America, go straight to Butte." And that just gives you a sense of how significant Butte was to people who were coming to America in that era. And of course, they were going to Butte because there were jobs there. There were mining jobs there, and that it was that mining wealth in Butte that really led most directly to Montana becoming a state. Montana flag says oro y plata, which means gold and silver. What it really ought to say is copper, and I don't know what the Spanish word is for copper, but the flag should say copper because it's really copper, and specifically Butte's copper, that made Montana state.
Unbelievable. And the work that was being done when the United States, when Washington, D.C. discovered this treasure in the treasure state, caused them to take more of an interest, a personal interest even, and it was making money.
Well, it's interesting because speaking of Marcus Daly and him going to California first, what happened, of course, is there was the great gold rush that began with the 49ers. But after about a decade or so, that easy, what they call placer gold, which comes from the Spanish word for easy, that gold that a man could pan using literally a pan of gold, that easy gold by the late 1850s had pretty much run out in California. And so all of those miners who had gone across the country to the coast searching for fame and fortune started drifting back eastward across the continent, looking for at those places that they kind of skipped over on the way out. So they went back to places like Colorado, Nevada, and eventually in 1862, gold is discovered in Montana during the Civil War. And it's that gold discovery in Montana that leads to a huge rush of gold miners coming up that Powder River Valley, across Wyoming, and into the gold fields of Montana during the Civil War and immediately after the Civil War in the 1860s.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable story. And I run into this head on with my family on a wagon train headed west as I'm a direct descendant of the Donner Party.
You
And
talked
so
about that, which is crazy.
yeah, it is really unbelievable. And so you see, I put everything in context of course, like we all do, I often ask my mom, when did this or that happen? She'll say, well, grandma was, and so we all as
Right,
people have these milestones that mark our perspective, that kind of hem in our world view of a timeline. And so for
right.
me, it's always 1846, 1847, the Donner Party.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that about your family and your personal connection to Western history, because one of the things that is so amazing to me about the history of the American West is in the scheme of global history, it's all quite recent.
Yeah.
And I think all of us can touch lives that touched these historical events themselves. And I
Yes.
remember I was born in, as I mentioned, in a small town called Lovell, Wyoming. I was born in 1964, and I remember as a young boy, there was an old woman who lived next to my family, named Mrs. Weathersby. I can remember her to this day. She passed out those vanilla wafer cookies to all the kids on the street. But she was 90 years old in the 1960s, and she had come to Lovell, Wyoming, on a covered wagon. And she remembered in her life the mountain men coming down from the Bighorn Mountains and resupplying in the fall before heading back out to their, mountain retreats where they would camp out for the winter. And so just the ability to know somebody like that who through one life you can actually touch those lives in the 19th century is an amazing thing about our history. And I think it's one of the things that makes it so personal. We were talking at the beginning about the human aspects of Western American history. All history is very personal, but that's one of the things that makes it very personal to me.
Hmm. And you dove deep into American history in Wyoming when
I
you were a
did.
child, right?
I had a couple unique opportunities.
Tell us.
One of the coolest things that I did growing up is as I mentioned, I grew up for the most part in a town called Torrington in southeastern Wyoming that happens to be 20 miles from Fort Laramie National Historic Site, the place where this huge fort, Fort Laramie, was on the Oregon Trail.
Yeah.
And it's run by the National Park Service. And as a high school student, I had the opportunity, and then as a college student, I had an opportunity to work there in the summer through a program they called the Living History Interpretation Program. And I got paid, which seems remarkable to me even today, to dress up every day in an 1876 cavalry uniform and to talk to tourists all day about the history of Fort Laramie and the American West. We baked army bread in a wood-burning oven. We fired a 1847 Mountain Howitzer twice a day. We did flag retreats in the morning. We did all these things that gave me an opportunity to have this as close as you can get to a first-person experience of the 19th century. And it built on what was already a strong love of history for me. And it made those events even more real, which is something that has played into all the writing that I've done.
It absolutely translates. You can experience the five senses from somebody who feels like a reputable voice in your books. And I know that comes
Great.
from your hands to that proverbial plow, baking of that bread, the flour that's there, the sound of what the echo sounds like in the void of the western sky. It all translates in your writing. And I so
Well,
love it.
that's music to my ears. That's certainly what I'm going for. And when you truly love something and want to be a writer, the whole goal is to take something that you love and appreciate and to try and share that in a way with readers that they'll appreciate it in the same way. And so that's the goal of doing the research, spending a lot of time outdoors to understand the natural environment that we live in, doing all those things that hopefully give authenticity to stories in a way that brings it to life and makes it real for people.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. One of the things that I really also love is that you take time, and I don't know if you do this intentionally or not, but you take time to give honor to young people in your stories. I'm thinking of the story in Ridgeline, how you're helping the younger ones see the ways of the older ones through, what's a good word for it? Quiet teaching. And it happens also in Fire and Brimstone. You're seeing a value of a young character, and they are carrying really the weight of the world. And they're coming off in a way that is humble, that is authentic. Do you want to honor those younger people?
Well, I think the stories that I'm telling, those characters deserve to be honored for the things that they've done, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. One of the most fascinating characters, and I've got his picture on my wall behind me for those who are seeing the video portion of this. There's a picture of Jim Bridger back there. That's a picture of Jim Bridger as an old man. he's an old man in the story Ridgeline that you mentioned, which is this book about 1866 when Bridger was a scout for the U.S. Army. I originally came across Jim Bridger because he shows up as a very young man in the book The Revenant that I wrote, which is about this bear attack that takes place. This fur trapper named Hugh Glass is attacked by a grizzly bear, and he's abandoned by his companions. And one of the companions he's abandoned by is a very young, probably 17-year-old Jim Bridger, who was on his first trip west of the Mississippi River. And one of the things I love about the Jim Bridger life is he has this incident that I suspect he very much regrets in his youth, where he abandons this wounded person. And I think he probably spent a lot of his life overcoming that and ends up being somebody who has a rich historical legacy and is very much respected for his integrity by history. But he begins off with that incident that no doubt was linked very much to his inexperience as a youth. So I love that kind of arc across two books, The Revenant and Ridgeline with Jim Bridger. But another example of a very young character who I think deserves incredible admiration is Crazy Horse. In the book Ridgeline in 1866, Crazy Horse is not yet the well-known chief and leader that he will be 10 years later at the Battle of Little Bighorn. In 1866, he's a young man in his 20s and has no doubt all of the impetuousness and inexperience and those other
Tenacity.
kind of tenacity, fearlessness
Yeah.
that comes along with youth. And we see the importance and the strength of those aspects of his character as a young man in the role that he plays in the battle that takes place the many battles that take place over the fall of 1866, leading up to this big fight with Fetterman on December 21st, 1866. But I love the contrast between the youth of Crazy Horse in that story and the experienced leadership of Red Cloud, who is the older, more experienced chief that is leading a whole confederation of tribes, and the kind of contrast in the roles based in part just on their ages. And so I think that theme you're talking about of youth is a really interesting one.
Mm. Yeah, that also takes me to the theme of greed. It seems like there is a greed in all of your works, whether it's an individual inward greed or whether it's we'll be the first to dig out every piece of copper in this copper mine. There is a drive in your characters. And is that because you see the drive in the people in their accounts in history?
Everything I've done is either straight up a nonfiction historical account, and Fire and Brimstone is straight up nonfiction, although I hope it's told in a very narrative, kind of interesting way, or it's historical fiction, which, although it's fictionalized, is based on true stories, and I've tried to make it as accurate as I possibly can.
Yeah.
Those examples would be The Revenant and Ridgeline. But in all of the cases, I'm trying to take true life people and present them in a way that is fair to their historical record. And look, there is a lot of greed and drive, some of it virtuous, some of it not so virtuous, behind what is leading people to come west in the 19th century. A common denominator is people are trying to make a living
Yes.
in an environment with no social net, and I have enormous amount of respect for those people who are coming west seeking their fortunes. And that's one important part of the story of the West. Now, the other side of that is there were people who were already here, and that leads to a huge amount of conflict, and you see that play out most dramatically in the Indian Wars, but also in things like the decimation of the buffalo. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's okay to recognize both the nobility and the tragedy of the indigenous tribes who were already here and who fought against that wave of emigration, but also to acknowledge the bravery of those people who were coming west and understand the motivations that were driving them as they try to build better lives for themselves and their families. It often comes together in tragic ways, but it's a story that deserves to be told in its full complexity.
I would love to know how you first became interested in the Native American stories in several different tribes.
I was a big library kid growing up, and I can remember when I was in second grade in Lovell, Wyoming, going to the library and checking out a book about Crazy Horse. And it was, I remember being reading that book and being just enormously inspired by his story. And it was one of those books that was written very much towards an audience of elementary kids, obviously, and it focused on his boyhood. But I was inspired by that, and so Crazy Horse has been one of those characters who's always stuck in my mind. Working at Fort Laramie, as I mentioned, in high
Yeah.
school, a lot of what I learned about there was the Indian Wars of the 1860s and 1870s. And I became very interested in the Northern Plains tribes, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crow. And then in doing research on the fur trade, in working on the Revenant, became very interested in tribes like the Arikara, the Blackfeet that were most associated with the fur trade era. So I've really had this recurrent theme of interest in American tribal history that is woven in as much as I possibly can to the stories that I've written. You obviously can't begin to even think about Western American history without
Yeah.
working hard to understand the story of Native Americans.
You and I have talked before that a lot of people think that this is the story of history, but I grew up because Montana is not a very populated state. We would play six-man football, we would play basketball, and a lot of our opposing teams were tribes, and we would play against the Absaroka Indians. We would play against the Blackfeet. We would play, against all these different tribes. And so my experience with the Native American culture is very current and has, been something I'd listened to even before I played sports or knew anything about it. We would listen over AM radio to the game being called, and you'd hear very American names against very tribal names as the ball was passed or as defense was happening.
It's funny you should talk about that. I'm going tonight to a basketball game between Salish Kootenai College and the University of Montana here in Missoula. That history of basketball among Indigenous Americans will be very much on display tonight. So
I'm sure.
looking forward to that game.
I hope that there is a tribal dance at halftime. That's how it used to be, and I really hope it still's that way.
We'll see. I'll look forward to that.
Well, let's talk about a youngster in Fire and Brimstone, which talks about the North Butte mining disaster of 1917. He's newly married because of his job at the mine,
Right.
has an amazing memory recall of how these different mines all come together.
Yeah.
And he's really the hero of the story, I think.
Well, let me set the scene for that a little bit, if it's
Yeah,
okay. And the
please.
character you're talking about, and this is from the book Fire and Brimstone, which is, as I mentioned, completely nonfiction. This character, Manus Dugan, was a young 20s miner in 1917, which is the year of the worst hard rock mining disaster and still in American history. It takes place in Butte, Montana. And what happened on that evening is that there were hundreds of men who were working thousands of feet below ground because in 1917 in Butte, and this is an amazing thing when you just think about the technology, they were drilling and mining thousands of as much as a mile below ground, below the surface in Butte, Montana. They had the technology to do that in that era, but of course it was insanely dangerous. And what happens on that evening in 1917 is a fire breaks out in the mine, and it actually is burning above the heads of many of the men who are working below ground. And in addition to the fire itself, this fire is putting out all of these poisonous fumes, which are between the fire and the poisonous fumes, many of the potential exit ways out of the mine are blocked. And this guy, Manus Dugan, the reason he's so important, he wasn't the most senior person at the mine or the person who got paid the most, but his job was what was called a nipper. And a nipper's job was to go all around the mine all day long and pass out sharp tool bits. The miners who were using the bits would use their tools all day long, and their drill bits would dull, and they needed sharp drill bits. So Manus Dugan would go all over the mine. He would exchange the sharp drill bits for the dull bits, and he would move on with his job. As a result of this job, he knew the inner workings of the mine like the back of his hand. That was in contrast to most of the workers who didn't know anything about the inner workings of the mine. Many of them were brand new on the job. They were lowered to a place where they dug all day. At the end of the day, they were let out. They had no idea where to go.
And
And so this
a lot of them were new to Butte. I mean,
brand new to Butte,
coming right
right
from
off
New
essentially
York.
off the boat. Many of them not speaking English. The no smoking signs at the mine in this era were printed in 17 different languages. So that gives you a sense of just the ethnicity and the variety of languages, how hard it was to communicate. So what Manus Dugan does is, as these confused groups of men gather up below ground on that evening, he realizes that there's no way to the surface through the poisonous gas and fire. And he advises them to do something that sounds incredible at the time and even today. He advises them to go deeper into the mine, to find a place where the air is clear, and then literally to build a airproof wall to hide behind on the other side of the gas, and then just wait it out. Wait for the fire to clear, wait for the gases to clear, wait for rescue. And he convinces this group of men that that's their best chance of survival, and he leads them to a safe place. He leads them in building what they called a bulkhead to keep out the gas, and then they wait it out. And I won't totally reveal the outcome of the story, but many of the men that go with Dugan are saved because of going with him. Sadly, Dugan is not one of the survivors, but he's the tragic hero of this story, no doubt.
He is. And I love the way you tell the story in the blackness underneath the ground. There's still so much description, and I would argue that there is as much description in the blackness underneath that mine as there is on the prairie land of Ridgeline. I you 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 take us there and hold our breaths really as we're reading through the paragraphs of their experience.
Well, thanks, Nick. I'm happy that it impacted you that way. Um, I love just about everything about the outdoors. Below ground, I have to say, is tough for me. I had a chance in Butte to go down in one of the drifts and wind around, and then have the lights turned out and experience what that true blackness is of a complete absence of light, the type of blackness to which your eyes never adjust.
Yeah.
That is a tough environment for me, I got to say. And the men who worked in that environment every day, and even more so the men who experienced and survived this disaster, it's a quite dramatic incident, to say the least.
I, as a child, went in Lewis and Clark Caverns,
Yep.
and that would be my experience with the
Yeah.
blackness and the tight closure of that.
It
Go
is a
ahead.
different blackness, and it's not the same as the blackness at night to which your eyes adjust. It is the complete absence of light, and these men, as part of this experience, were in that for days, days and nights.
Unbelievable. And what they were really doing, I think, was helping World War II. Is that right?
World War One, yeah. So this is on the eve of the America's entry into World War One, and actually, you're just as correct to say World War Two because Butte did the exact same thing in support of World War Two as well. But um, copper is a incredibly strategic resource in a military sense. It's used to make shell casings most significantly. And so copper is one of the main inputs to the war industry. Butte, at the time of this disaster in 1917, was actually occupied by the U.S. Army because they were worried about the potential of sabotage on the mines by Germany, recognizing that these copper assets were an enormous war resource that was very important to what most people thought was about to be the American entry into World War One.
And I'll just add Germany because there were immigrants from Germany working in the mines. So
It's
it was
so
suspect.
Butte is basically a model of like a mini Europe. So every ethnicity that is in Europe is in Butte, and all of those conflicts that were in Europe were also in Butte. So, yes, there were lots of Germans who were watching their new country prepare to go to war against their old country. There were lots of English in Butte who were cheering the fact that Americans were going to go into the war on the side of the English. There's a huge Irish contingent in Butte who hate the English and don't want the U.S. going into war alongside the English any more than the Germans do. There's the Finlanders who are known as the most radical of the radicals. And the Finlanders at that time were supporting the Russians and the move towards communism. And so all of those kind of European politics are swirling around on the surface, even as this fire is burning below the surface in Butte. And that's part of what the book is about as well. And
Yeah.
part of what drew me to the story is not only is there this incredible adventure story of these
Yeah.
men who are trapped below ground by a fire, fighting for their lives, but on the surface, there's this incredible historical and political story about Montana in 1917, which most people, and me at the time, certainly didn't know anything about.
And I accidentally knew about just enough of it.
Mm,
It was amazing growing up in the Bitterroot Valley, just on basically on the other side of the mountain there. I came from a family called Foley, obviously
right?
Irish. My grandmother falls in love in Butte with a man named Curtis, which is obviously English.
Yep.
And the fight is on in our family
Yeah.
from that moment. And it just was alive to me at every turn in the Bitterroot Valley. And so when I encountered this book, I found myself just laughing sometimes. And there's not a place to laugh in the story, but just because I was grateful for you putting this story to paper. It's a hard story to tell. It's
Well,
a,
thanks for that. I will say I felt I hope I've done a good job with it. I felt a huge responsibility to the story because one of the things when I started traveling to Butte and spending this time at the Butte Silverbow Archives and other places in Butte that I mentioned, um, one of the things that is screamingly obvious from the second you arrive in Butte
yeah.
is that the people of Butte are very proud of, as they should be, but also protective of their story. And I think
Mm.
there's a perception that's not wrong that Butte is looked down upon by part of the state today.
Yeah.
Butte, Montana does not look like the picture postcards of our mountains and forests that we sell at most of the filling stations. Butte is a different animal. Butte does not look like the rest of the state, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason because it's been digging itself up to make these contributions to the building of America to the fighting of our wars to the digital economy. It's been doing that for more than a century, and there are lasting effects of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the people there take that history incredibly seriously, and they're proud of it. And I felt a huge responsibility to try and tell the history right. And
Mm-hmm.
I knew that if I didn't, that I'd hear about it. So it was extra incentive.
When I drove through last time, there's a big billboard that says she's a Butte.
Yep.
And
Yes, you.
it was fun to see Butte in her glory in Fire and Brimstone. It was really,
Well, it's an amazing story, and I'm not the first person to tell it, but I hope that this story is one that has spoken to contemporary audiences in a way that brings more people to the story because it's table stakes as far as Montana history goes, an
yeah.
understanding of Butte. But you also realize when you study about Butte that so much of our national history is built on Butte as well. So it's not just a story about Montana, it's also a story about the country.
Hmm. Yes. And the Copper Kings, of course,
Right.
including Marcus Daly. Let's go in our final moments here together. Let's go to film and television. I do want to
Yeah.
ask you how you felt the first time you saw The Revenant and Leonardo
Yeah.
DiCaprio playing Glass. How did that impact you watching that?
So that was a pretty wild experience, I have to say. Obviously, it's a really cool thing to publish a book and to have that out there in the world and to kind of know that people are reading your story. A movie, and I've only had one of them be made, is sort of a whole different level just in terms of pop culture awareness. And I was living on a government assignment in Switzerland at the time that the Revenant came out, so I didn't get to experience all of this myself. But there were advertisements on, during NFL games. When we went to Los Angeles for the Golden Globes and for the Oscars, there were billboards all over town with the movie poster on it, including my name up there, even kind of you couldn't see it very well, but I could see it. Um, and that just was a whole different order of kind of awareness and, you know, realizing that your story is being heard by and seen by a bigger audience that was really cool. Also, as a side note, it's the only thing I've ever done in my professional history that my kids actually genuinely thought was really cool. So I like scoring those points and took note of that for sure.
That's so sweet. Very, very sweet. You have connected with Kevin Costner. And
Yeah.
can you tell a little bit about what you guys are collaborating on right now?
So Kevin Costner is the narrator and producer of a History Channel series about the American West. It's a great series. It's on History Channel now. I encourage people to go watch it. And they do a really cool job, I think, of covering a very broad span of the history of the American West, but doing it in a very story-friendly way. They focus on kind of individual anecdotes that are kind of typical of a particular era. And for the Indian War era, one of the things they focus on is the Fetterman Massacre, this battle that I mentioned that this book of mine, Ridgeline, is about, that takes place in the Powder River Valley in 1866. And so I was one of the talking heads for that episode, talking about the history of the Fetterman fight, which was just a really fun experience to be a part of that. And I do think that's really something that people who like Western history will enjoy. One of the other producers on that is Doris Kearns Goodwin, who, of course, is the great American historian. So there's really a lot of different elements to that I think people will enjoy.
It's available now. I hope you watch it. And we didn't even get a chance to really talk about all the things that you've done in the governmental space and all the work that you have personally dedicated outside of your Wyoming post as a child. You've grown into that.
Well, I've always kind of had twin loves. I've always loved Western American history, but I've always been very interested in kind of global affairs as well. And I went to law school after undergraduate and studied international law and ended up in my 20s working in a couple of government jobs in Washington, D.C. I worked for a U.S. senator. I worked at the National Security Council and ultimately had an opportunity to be a U.S. ambassador in Geneva. And so I've had some interesting experiences on that front that sometimes are confusing to explain in kind of one integrated narrative, but it all sort of makes sense to me.
It's amazing. You are an incredible soul. You have
Well, thank you for that. You're very kind.
you gathered a lot in your lifetime, and we're looking forward to what you bring to the fore as we go forward.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of these stories today, I'm especially pleased that some of them have touched you. So that's a great thing. Thanks for your interest.
Absolutely. I've been with Michael Punke today. Make sure you check out all his works. We are so grateful to have had a moment to talk to you, dig in deep to you as a writer and you as a person. Thank you for sharing today, Michael.
Thanks, Nick. Great to talk.
Thank you for supporting the writing of authors like Michael Punke, who painstakingly research and really present an opportunity for us to encounter our history in words right before us today.